For these two examples on factoring polynomials, we will use a technique that is called grouping. Factor by grouping. And this is what that means. What we do is, since I have four, and we generally have four terms when we do grouping, four terms that we cannot combine together because they're not like terms. Okay? And I think I made a mistake here. This should say squared. I'm sorry about that. This should be squared. Okay? You have four terms, and you have nothing in common between the four terms. So you can't factor out anything like we did in the previous video. So here my approach is going to be grouping pairs of terms. Okay, before you start grouping, make sure your polynomial is written in standard form, which is in descending order of powers. Okay, so this is my first step here would be to take these two terms and group them, and this plus sign I bring down, and then take these two terms and group them. That's your first step. Your second step is this first group that you made, factor out what's common here. And what's common here is an x squared term. So I'm going to factor out x squared, and x squared times x will give me x cubed. This minus sign I bring down, and x squared times 3 will give me 3x squared. And there you've factored the first group. Now bring down the plus sign. Bring down that plus sign and factor the second group. The second group, they have a 4 in common because 4 is a factor here and 12 has both factors of 4 and 3. So they share a factor of 4. So bring out the 4, and 4 times what will give you 4x? 4x times x minus minus, and 4 times what will give you 12 times 3. And there you have factored both groups. Now, very important, I can factor further because this term here, I have two terms, this one and this one, separated by the plus sign. This term here has a factor that this term also has. So this factor, x minus 3, and this one, x minus 3, they have in common. And what do we do whenever we have something that's in common? We factor it out of the polynomial. So that x minus 3, this one, and this one that's in common, I'll bring out as my common factor. And then x minus 3, that first term was accompanied by x squared. So there's my x squared plus, plus. And this second term, x minus 3, was accompanied by the 4. So when you go back and you multiply x minus 3 times that first term, you will get this first term, right, without distributing anything. And when you multiply that term times this term, you will get the second term. So this will be your final answer. X minus 3 times x squared plus 4. For our second example, again, let's do grouping, but this one is a little bit more complicated and you will see why. When I take my first two terms and my last two terms, I make my groups, x cubed minus 2x squared, and then I have this minus sign here, minus 5x plus 10. And here's where I'll have problems. And this is the problem I'll have. When I write minus here and I close these two terms in parentheses, this minus will distribute out within this parentheses, and this will be negative 5x. which is okay because I had minus 5x originally. But when I distribute it to the second term, to the 10, that makes this 10 negative 10. And originally, this was not negative 10. So I have to make sure that in each step, I keep my original polynomial. And this that I did here just changed my polynomial. It changed it into this. X cubed minus 2x squared minus 5x minus 10 if I were to distribute this minus to each one of the terms. And when I compare this polynomial to the original one, they are not the same polynomial. It's not the same thing to add 10 to something than to subtract 10 to something. So there's a problem when I use grouping and you have a minus here. And you have to be very careful. We have to fix that. Now, we have to make arrangements to fix this. And what you do is that first group, that's okay. That's not bothering anything. It's not changing anything. But this second group, here's what I do. Instead of writing plus 10, I will write minus 10. And now, when I distribute this negative, I will have x cubed minus 2x squared minus 5x, and negative times negative will give me plus 10. And this does look like my original polynomial. So be careful here. I have to do adjustments to make sure I have the original function. Okay? And this is what we did. Now we can continue factoring. Let's take the first group and factor it. And what they have in common is an x squared term times x minus 2 minus minus. And this second term, what they have in common is a 5 times x minus 2. Okay? And now notice that your first and your second terms have, this is your first term, this is your second term, and they have something in common. They have x minus 2 and x minus 2. They both have it. So I can factor out x minus 2. And then what's left is what accompanied the first term was x squared minus minus, and what accompanied the second term is 5. And there, you're done. That's your final answer. I hope you understood. I encourage you to do these problems on your own. Hit rewind, do them on your own, and then come back and check if you get the same answer as me. I will see you in the next example.